Greetings, welcome to the Psych 487 capstone class lecture on functionalism. Just some basics of functionalism before we get started here. Functionalism really serves as the first uniquely American system of psychology. Wundtian psychology and structuralism pretty much get their basis out of Germany in the 1870s. Wundt obviously is there at the University of Leipzig. Titchener goes and studies with Wundt and then comes back to America and founds the Department of Psychology at Cornell University. Is there for 35 years. But functionalism really is born and invented, and really is its birthplace is the United States. Structuralists were interested in understanding the structure, the pieces, the parts of consciousness. They wanted to deconstruct it. It was very mechanical, mechanistic. Functionalism shifts its purpose for understanding not so much how it works structurally, but why it works functionally. What does it do for us? What does consciousness allow us to do compared to animals, compared to children? And so functionalism is going to look at the function of consciousness, whereas structuralism looked at the structure of consciousness. This approach was really offered as a challenge, as a probably more of a revolutionary approach than an evolutionary approach. So it really wasn't offered as an alternative to the mainstream or whatnot of the 1910s, 1920s, but functionalism is really offered as a replacement. It was a challenge. It wasn't an alternative. So really one of the key people in functionalism and what led to functionalism is William James, who lived from 1842 to 1910. James really has no psychological disciple, so to speak. He didn't really found a system like Wundt or like Titchener or something like that. At the academic year 1875-1876, during that academic year at Harvard, they offered the experimental psychology course. And in fact, some psychology historians could make the case that this could be the founding of psychology, although we typically give the founding to 1879 and Wilhelm Wundt in Leipzig, Germany. So he offers the class. It's called experimental psychology. In fact, you can see the title there at the bottom of the screen, the relations between physiology and psychology. He established a laboratory for demonstrations. The difference with Wundt is, and at least this is how historians describe it, is that Wundt gets laboratory space that's uniquely designed and devoted to psychology specifically, as opposed to William James, who probably what he did is that he took lab space already assigned to physiology or biology or some other department and then kind of co-opted it for psychology. And so, rightly or wrongly, that's kind of the demarcation as to the founding of psychology, when Wundt has space specifically designed and intentioned for psychological studies. William James wrote a very famous Principles of Psychology. It's really the first, extremely long, by the way, a 2-volume general psychology textbook, where it kind of tries to capture, really, for its time, the totality of psychology and what we knew up until that point. And so, you might put it in the genre of a general psychology textbook, but it's really, in some ways, an attempt at a comprehensive understanding of psychology as we know it at the time in 1890. As you can imagine, students taking this 2-volume set of books to class would get tired of that. And so in 1892, William James publishes a briefer version, a condensed version. And ironically, even to this day, if you see 700, 800-page psychology textbooks, oftentimes the publisher will have the author write a briefer version. So that notion of a briefer version goes back, at least 110 years in terms of a tradition in psychology. So really this Jamesian approach of functionalism is going to be that you study people as they live. And so it's about the functioning of consciousness. And here it is on the screen, the functional utility of consciousness, which enables us to adapt to our environment by making choices. And so you can really see some of the antecedents coming through. This antecedent influence of Darwin and Galton with respect to, functioning in the environment, adaptation, survival of the fittest. You can see now that we've shifted to, rather than plants and animals and generations of species, we're talking about human beings and generations of those as human beings. And so adaptation, survival of fittest, how does consciousness help allow us to function and adapt and change in the conditions of a changing environment? So the methods of functionalism are going to be still introspection, which is still continuing with regard to functionalism, an experimental method where we're setting up a study with a research group, an experimental group, and a control group, and very much a comparison or a comparative approach or comparative psychology. And so by comparing our behavior as adults to children, by comparing our behavior to non-human primates. So we can learn things about ourselves by looking at our development from childhood to adulthood, as well as comparatively speaking from other non-human primate species to humans. And so those are going to be the chief methods of functionalism. William James had a keen interest in emotions. In fact, in introductory psychology textbooks to this day, you'll find the James Lange theory of emotions. And so that's something that still exists. And so before James, kind of the notion was with regard to emotional responses that you might see a bear in the woods, you get frightened, and then you run. And that kind of makes sense, really, if you think about it. You see a bear, you get frightened or excited, then you run. James postulated and hypothesized that the physical response precedes the appearance of the actual emotion. And so sometimes you see the bear, you run, and then you realize, hey, I'm frightened. And interestingly, if you think about this, if you've been around small kids enough, you can kind of see this sometimes. You've got a toddler who's, just dinking around in the living room, and they fall down. They trip, they fall. Somebody, some older child hits them or something. It's really kind of interesting. If you watch this, you can see that sometimes the child will look around to see, should I cry or not? And so if the parents are going, oh goodness, oh my gosh, and then the kid will go, but if the parents are just kind of laughing and just kind of being, kind of staid and solid, the child sometimes won't have any reaction at all. And so even on this intuitive level, you can see that William James had something here with regards to emotion. And so his alternative was that you experience the event, you see the bear, you have some sort of reaction, and then you decide, oh, I'm scared. And I must be scared because I'm running. And so an interesting idea that gets compared to other emotion theories in any kind of classic general psychology textbook to this day. And so as I mentioned earlier, it's called the James Lange theory of emotions. So why is William James thought to be so influential? He's not a founder of anything. There's not a Jamesian system of psychology. Well, first off, he wrote with brilliance and clarity, which really, if you go back and read many things from the 1890s, that's pretty rare. And so to have that kind of clarity of thought and to be able to communicate it in writing, even though a 2-volume general psychology textbook is a little bit much, it's still a rare quality, which makes him very influential in psychology. He part of this is zeitgeist. He had the right ideas at the right times with regard to being adapted and adopted widely. He opposed the analysis of consciousness into elements, and sometimes timing is everything, the zeitgeist, if you will. And so James can come along at a time when, structuralism, it's in its waning moments, the new kids on the block come around, so to speak, and so functionalism is ready to knock it off the top of the king of the hill, so to speak, of systems in psychology, at least in the United States. And again, it was an alternative, and so alternative ideas are welcome in the sciences, and so functionalism comes along and offers an alternative approach for looking at the mind and consciousness. And there's only so much you can really learn by taking stuff apart and analyzing the parts. You can look at a carburetor and take it apart and deconstruct it and then reconstruct it. But at some level, you might want to tinker with, well, how do we make it better? How do we make it adapt to different environments? How does that carburetor work at high altitudes versus low altitudes? Well, how can we tinker with it? And I think functionalism really is kind of, in some ways, that notion of tinkering. Okay, so we can take it apart and we can deconstruct it all we want through introspection. But why does it work the way it does? And so are there ways that we could improve it if we wanted to? We're looking at the functions of consciousness as opposed to the structure of consciousness. And so these are just some of the notions from historians of psychology as why William James would be so influential with regard to functionalism in the United States. Another famous psychologist that comes along who is falls in the functionalist camp is G. Stanley Hall. The G, by the way, stands for Granville, and so it's Granville Stanley Hall, and so we he abbreviated it G. Stanley Hall, so that's how we do it. Kind of like some people like R. Eric Landrum, so whatever. So anyway, G. Stanley Hall is very famous in psychology, and you're going to see why here in a second for his famous series of firsts. He's not really a founder of functionalism, but he's certainly a contributor. And some historians have called the G. Stanley Hall the Darwin of the mind. He earns his degree at Harvard at 1878, and then he goes to Leipzig. He studies with the master. He takes the boat over. He takes the boat back. And so he kind of makes the pilgrimage, if you will, to study with the founder of psychology, Wilhelm Wundt. He is the founder, that is G. Stanley Hall, is the founder of the first psychology laboratory at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore in 1883. He's going to have some famous students of his own. Cattell and Dewey are going to be famous students of G. Stanley Hall. And G. Stanley Hall is really famous for this series of firsts. He's the first American PhD in psychology. So he goes, he gets a degree at Harvard, then he goes to Leipzig, studies with Wundt, comes back. He's the first American student who studied in the first psychology laboratory in the first year it opened, 1879. Again, that's the trip to Germany and his work with Wundt. He begins the first research laboratory in the United States upon his return from Germany. He's the founder of the first American Journal of Psychology. He's the first president of Clark University. He's the organizer and first president of the American Psychological Association. And in the history of psychology in the United States, 11 of the first 14 PhD students are his. So any one of these bullet points here on this slide would get you into the psychology history textbook, but look at all the things that he did. And I've given you this list kind of quickly, but I want to come back to this one, second to the last here. He's the organizer and first president of the American Psychological Association. And so APA is the largest organization in the world today of psychologists. And so worldwide, there's over 150,000 members. And even though it's called the American Psychological Association, that is indeed correct. There are members worldwide. And so this is a huge thing. APA gets its founding in 1892. He's the first president. He's the organizer. And it still exists to this day. And again, it's the largest and perhaps the strongest association of psychologists in the world. And so just an amazing level of contribution. In fact, even to this day, there's an annual G. Stanley Hall lecture series that different people from around the country are selected to give at different conferences and conventions across the United States. So in 1887, G. Stanley Hall is the founder of the first American Journal of Psychology, which he calls the American Journal of Psychology. And interestingly enough, this journal is still in print to this day. In 1892, as I've already mentioned, he's the founder of the American Psychological Association with the help of a few dozen fellow psychologists as organizers. I believe that first year there are 13. It really is G. Stanley Hall plus a dozen. And so I believe there's 13 members of APA when it's founded in 1892. 8 years later, there are 127 members. And so you can see that this notion for an association catches on, and it starts to grow fairly quickly. Within 8 years, it's almost multiplied by 10 in terms of the original founding number of members. In 1909, on the 20th anniversary of the founding of Clark University, so remember, Clark University, G. Stanley Hall is going to be the first president. That's going to make that, 1889, 1909, the 20th anniversary, 1909. He, that is G. Stanley Hall, invites dignitaries from around the world, especially within the field of psychology, to come to Clark University in the United States and celebrate its 20th anniversary. He invites, including, among other dignitaries, Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung. They both make the trip over here. For Freud, it's Freud's only visit to America. And so I've got a picture here, and I'll give you the details of who's who here in a moment. But interestingly enough, if you go back and have a chance someday, you can read about Freud's correspondence before and after his trip to America. He wasn't a real big fan. I don't mean to, that's kind of a spoiler alert here, but he wasn't a real big fan of America. And we'll talk more about those details later on in this course as we continue our discussion on the history of psychology. So this is kind of a famous photograph outside of one of the main halls at Clark University. And the front row has the dignitaries, and sadly the back row has the folks who are less famous in psychology. So depending on how often you've seen this commonly in print, this guy right here would be Sigmund Freud. This is G. Stanley Hall in the middle, and this is Carl Jung. And so you can see from in the front row, from left to right, is Sigmund Freud, G. Stanley Hall, Carl Jung. Back row, A. Brill, Ernest Jones, Sandor Ferenczi. I'm sorry. Brill, Jones, and Ferenczi. Brill is actually known as a historian in the history of psychology, probably the most famous historian at the time to be taken over. That helm will be taken over in the 1950s by E.G. Boring, a sadly ironic name for someone who studied and wrote about the history of psychology. And so you can imagine, founders and dignitaries, gathering on the university, on the grounds of Clark University for this anniversary celebration. How amazing that must have been at that time to be there, to be a participant, and to be reading about what happened there at the time. Another key figure in functionalism for us is going to be James McKeen Cattell. We mentioned Cattell briefly on a couple of slides ago when we talked about one of the famous students of G. Stanley Hall. The other one, by the way, on that slide was John Dewey, who is going to be a key founder in the history, in the advancement of educational psychology. And so, but to circle back to James McKeen Cattell, he is influenced. He meets Galton, the cousin of Charles Darwin, who has all the ideas about, measurement and the normal curve and eugenics and all that stuff we talked about in a prior lecture. I'll post it on YouTube. James McKeen Cattell's influence on U.S. psychology is very practical, applied. It's a test-oriented approach. And so Cattell's 16PF standing for 16 personality factors, is still a psychometric instrument in use today in terms of looking at personality preferences and personality characteristics and traits and states, if you will. Cattell is the first psychologist to teach statistics courses, and he stresses the need for statistical analysis of results. So once again, you can see the influences of Galton, who he meets, who he interacts with during his lifetime. And yes, Cattell is the guy who you can blame, in part, for the heavy emphasis on statistics in psychology and the social sciences. Cattell, rightly or wrongly, was also influenced by Galton with regard to the ideas about eugenics. Cattell in some ways kind of takes it to a whole new level that's not really a very impressive level, I have to admit, at least from my personal opinion. So he argues not only for, very high society folks to mate with other high society folks, to, that kind of, propagation of the species, but he also is an advocate for the sterilization of delinquents and defectives. And those are his words, not mine. I'm using the terminology of the day. He did want society to give incentives to the brightest and the wealthiest and healthiest people to marry their own kind. And I suppose it's admirable in some way. He put his money where his mouth was, Cattell did, and he offered his own 7 children $1,000 each, which would have been a huge fortune at the time if they would marry the offspring of college professors. Now, it's kind of ironic to think that college professors are overly intelligent because honestly, they tend to be intelligent only in a very narrow slice of life and can be really dumb in every other slice of life. Trust me about this. I'm familiar with this concept. And so we tend to stereotype in sort of a positive manner that professors are smart. They might be smart, but in one typically very narrow slice of behavior or science or whatever it is that they study. So anyway, and so you can see the prior influence of folks like Darwin and Galton on the ideas that Cattell proposed not only for his professional life, but also his personal life, including encouraging his children to marry well, by his definition. Cattell in 1888 is appointed a professor of psychology at the University of Pennsylvania. This is the first time this has ever happened in the world. And so before then, they would have been appointed a professor in the Department of Philosophy rather than the Department of Psychology. And so all others before Cattell were formally appointed in the philosophy department. And so again, one of the offspring, if you will, one of the professional offspring of G. Stanley Hall, James McKean Cattell, is going to have his own first, the first professor of psychology at the University of Pennsylvania. One of Cattell's famous students, who you may have heard of in the learning chapter of your intro psych textbook, would be E.L. Thorndike. And E.L. Thorndike is famous for the law of effect. And by the way, there are just very few laws. There's lots of hypotheses. There's a boatload of theories. There are very few laws in psychology. E.L. Thorndike is going to do the work with cats in a puzzle box, operant conditioning. He's going to be a contributor there. The law of effect goes to the notion of behaviors with pleasant consequences tend to be repeated, whereas behaviors with discomforting consequences tend to be eliminated. And so that's going to be his law of effect, and that's going to become a basic tenet of operant conditioning, and others will build on that in the operant conditioning tradition. So really, in a span of about a generation, there are rapid changes in America in general, and American psychology in particular. And so if in 1880 you were interested in studying psychology, this new science of human behavior, you got on a boat and you went to Germany. Hopefully you got in with Wundt at Leipzig. You got to study with the master. By 1900, by a relatively short 20 years later, a generation later, you want to study psychology, you stay home if you're in the United States. And so you don't get on a boat. You don't have to be you still got to be wealthy to go to college at that time, but you don't have to be so wealthy that you can afford to get on a boat and go across the ocean and study with Wundt and live there and pay for tuition and fees and boarding and all that kind of stuff. And so there really are rapid changes in American psychology within this span of 20 years from 1880 to 1900. In the 1913 edition of Who's Who in Science, and this is a publication, by the way, that exists to this day, in a listing of the world's leading psychologists in 1913 edition, there are 84 of the world's leading psychologists listed as being in the United States. And by 1913, that's more famous psychologists than Germany, England, and France combined. All right, and so again, from 1880 to 1913 is 33 years. And so by almost 2 generations later from the founding of psychology, America is outpacing, its excellence and its dominance in terms of, at least this one metric, the world's leading psychologists. I mean, think about it. Germany is really the founding place of psychology and psychological thought in 1879, and by 20 some years later, America has more famous psychologists, according to this one idea, than Germany, England, and France combined. And so that's actually kind of remarkable if you actually stop and think about the impact that has on the development of psychology in the United States. Here's another way to look at it. This is actually less than a generation. This is 15 years. In the United States in 1880, there are no laboratories devoted to psychology, and there are 0 journals. 15 years later, there are 26 laboratories at colleges and universities across the country, and there are 3 journals. And so, again, you can just see the major changes that are going on, a real shift in regards to the center of psychology from Europe in the 1870s, 1880s to the United States by 1900, 1910, 1915. So just an incredibly rapid change in the center of the psychological universe, so to speak. As with any school of thought in psychology, there are going to be criticisms and contributions. Some of the criticisms of functionalism include an ambiguity. And so, we want to understand the functioning of consciousness. Well, that sounds all well and good, but what does that really mean exactly? What doesn't that mean? It's so big and broad that it's going to be hard for others to kind of wrap their head around what do functionalists really do? And so ambiguity of functionalism is going to be one of the criticisms here. Titchener at Cornell, it might be kind of an obvious critic because he's the guy who's the founder of structuralism. And as we know from prior lectures, we know that structuralism essentially dies with Titchener when Titchener dies. And so Titchener, to his purview, thinks that functionalism isn't even psychology at all. It might be physiology, it might be biology, but it's certainly not psychology. And so, Titchener is just going to define it away. And if you can get away with it, that's not a bad way to do things. But clearly, functionalism had its proponents, and it had its huge impacts, as you'll see here summarized in a couple of minutes. Another criticism of functionalism is that it was more eclectic than the prior procedures. And so this notion of eclecticism or being eclectic means that you kind of, mix and match for whatever works. And so there's not one dogmatic approach, but it is a very practical applied mixture of whatever works for whatever situation that you're in. And so, the critics of functionalism are going to criticize it because there is no one dominant methodological approach. Of course, and by the way, this is a pretty common occurrence, the proponents of functionalism see this criticism as actually one of the strengths. And so, the proponents, the people who are in favor of functionalism are going to argue, hey, one of our strengths is that we're eclectic. We're not tied to any one dogma. We can actually, if we need to be introspectionists, we can. If we want to be comparative psychologists, we can do that. If we want to be look at psychology from a developmental viewpoint, we can do that too. And so, on the one hand, that eclecticism is going to be a source of criticism from outsiders like Titchener and the structuralists, but internally within functionalism, it's going to be one of their bragging points. That's going to be one of the ideas that they actually promote and think is a contribution. Now, from a different perspective, what would be the contributions of functionalism? Well, this research on animal behavior that really gets started with, and I'm going to forget, I'm going to say it's Margaret Floy Washburn, although it might be Lita Hollingworth, I can't remember. One of the first female PhD psychologists really gets this notion of animal psychology going. I think it's Washburn. But functionalism, as it continues to evolve and change over time, this notion of understanding and comparing animal behavior to human behavior, this research area becomes legitimized under the school of functionalism. Also, again, this eclectic approach broadens the viewpoint and the vantage point of researchers. And so functionalists are able to study children, the mentally retarded, the insane. And so, in fact, from a very practical viewpoint, that mention of insanity here is really one of the first mentions in the history of psychology where we're going to talk about abnormal psychology. And so notice we haven't even mentioned something like schizophrenia in these lectures. And so that's because the founding of psychology is not about helping people. The founding of psychology is about the science of understanding consciousness, the science of human behavior, the science of consciousness. It's not at all about abnormal psychology and personality theory so much and helping professions. And so functionalism is going to start to open the door for this broadening of psychology and psychological topics that researchers study and address. You can kind of see from the contributions of Cattell and of G. Stanley Hall and even William James, other methods beyond introspection are now legitimized within the school of functionalism. So physiological research, mental testing, questionnaires that come out of Galton's tradition and G. Stanley Hall as well, objective descriptions of behavior. William James was a contributor there to questionnaire techniques. And so we have this very eclectic, broad toolbox by which we can grab the appropriate tool for the appropriate situation and apply it, in a manner that will help us advance our understanding of consciousness